You're listening to the Danny Mobile Tech and Travel Podcast. Want to know what data is collected by Google when using their AI services? Wouldn't you like to know? The Danny Mobile Tech and Travel Podcast begins now.
All right, welcome back, everyone. Ready for another deep dive?
Definitely.
Today, we're taking a look at, well, something you probably ignore all the time, privacy policies.
Right.
Yeah, so specifically, Gemini apps. And they updated their privacy hub today, actually, February 12, 2025. And there's some interesting stuff in here.
Yeah, I mean, it's like, we all know you should read these, but
They're so long.
they're so dense and long, and so we're here to help break that down.
Especially for those of you who, you want to get the gist without wading through all the legalese.
Exactly.
So we're going to try to figure out exactly how Gemini apps uses, stores, and shares your data. And some of it was honestly kind of surprising, at least to me.
Yeah.
Like, did you know that even if you turn off activity tracking, Gemini keeps your conversations for up to 72 hours?
What?
Why would they do that? We're going to find out.
That's very interesting, yeah.
And we're also going to unpack that whole human reviewer thing that everybody's talking about.
Mm-hmm.
Like, what are they actually seeing? Should we be worried about privacy?
Good questions.
Yeah, we'll get into all of that.
Let's do it.
All right, so the very first section of the Gemini app's privacy notice is your data and Gemini apps. Seems like a logical place to start, I guess.
Sure.
What do you think? What's the main takeaway here?
I think this second really sets the stage for everything else that's coming. It really defines what Gemini apps is and kind of clarifies who is actually providing these apps because it's not always the same.
Okay, so when they say Gemini apps, what exactly are we talking about?
So we're talking about Google's conversational AI service, but specifically as it exists in the apps and services that reference this particular privacy notice.
So it's not like every single Google product is covered by this.
Right, exactly.
Okay, that makes sense. And then, as you said, the who is actually behind Gemini apps? Is it Google in Mountain View?
Well, that depends on where you are.
Okay.
So if you are in the European Economic Area or Switzerland, the provider is Google Ireland Limited, and for everyone else, it's Google LLC.
Oh, okay.
But they do refer to both as just Google going forward. So.
Yeah.
But it's worth noting that distinction,
I'm guessing that probably has something to do with like data privacy laws and all of that in the EU.
Yeah, most likely.
Okay. All right. So then we get to the part that I think probably everybody is most interested in. What data is collected and how it's used.
Right. This is where it gets real.
The rubber meets the road.
Yeah. What are they actually gathering about us while we're busy, chatting away with Gemini?
Yeah, so they're collecting your conversations with Gemini apps, which, I mean, that's pretty obvious.
Makes sense. But they're also collecting related product usage information,
Okay.
your location information, and any feedback that you might provide.
So they're painting a pretty detailed picture of how you're using their AI.
Mm-hmm.
But what's the purpose? What are they actually doing with all this data?
So they say this is all being used to provide, improve, and develop Google products and services, including their machine learning technologies. And this was interesting to me. They specifically call out that this includes enterprise products like Google Cloud.
Okay, so hold on. My late night attempts at writing a screenplay with Gemini could end up helping some big corporations streamline their cloud services.
That's possible. Yeah.
That's wild.
It is, but they do say this is all consistent with their overall privacy policy. So
Okay.
if you really want to go down that rabbit hole.
Yeah. All right, so moving on then. Gemini apps activity. This sounds important.
It is, yeah.
What is this exactly?
So this is basically a record of your interactions with Gemini apps, and here's the catch. It's on by default for adults.
Wait, so they're tracking every question I ask, every joke I attempt, every embarrassing typo, unless I specifically go in and tell them not to?
You got it.
Even if I think I'm just messing around with an AI.
Yeah, it's for users under 18, it's opt-in, but for adults, it's opt-out.
Okay.
So you have to proactively go into your settings and turn it off.
Something to keep in mind, folks. Check your settings. So how long are they keeping this data for?
So if your Gemini apps activity is turned on, they store that data with your Google account for up to 18 months by default, but you can adjust that time frame.
Okay.
You can go to 3 months or 36 months,
Okay.
depending on your preference.
So you do have some control over how long. What exactly, though, is included in this Gemini Apps activity. It can't just be the text of my conversation,
I
right?
know it is more than just the conversation itself. They're also logging your location information, and that includes both kind of your general area based on your device, and also any home or work addresses you might have saved in your Google account.
So it's all bundled together.
All bundled together, yeah.
Wow. Okay, so they're really building a comprehensive picture of your activity here. Okay, now I think the thing that makes a lot of people nervous, how human reviewers improve Google AI. I can feel the internet conspiracy theories swirling already.
Right.
So let's just address the elephant in the room, right?
Yeah.
Real people are reading and annotating your conversations with Gemini apps.
They are.
And I think that's where a lot of people start to get uneasy about their privacy, understandably so.
Understandably so,
Like,
yeah.
real people are reading my chats with an AI.
Yes.
That feels incredibly invasive.
Mm-hmm.
So why is that even necessary?
Well, they say it's all about quality control and improvement. And specifically, they're using this data to improve their generative machine learning models, which are kind of the brains behind Gemini apps.
So in a day, our data is being used to train their AI, even if it's not directly linked to our account.
That's right.
But what steps are they taking to protect privacy during this process? Are they just handing over our unfiltered conversations to a room full of strangers?
So they claim they disconnect your conversations from your Google account before reviewers see them.
Okay.
However, even with that step, they explicitly say, and I quote, "Please don't enter confidential information in your conversations or any data you wouldn't want a reviewer to see or Google to use."
That's a pretty big caveat.
Yeah,
So basically they're saying, like, be mindful of what you share.
yeah,
Treat it like you're talking to a real person because, in a way, you are.
exactly.
Don't tell Gemini anything you wouldn't tell your best friend, your therapist, or post on a public billboard.
Right, right.
Great advice. Okay, so let's move on to something a little more empowering. Configuring your settings. This is where we, the users, can actually take back some control, I hope.
Yes.
So this section lays out how you can manage your data and privacy within Gemini apps. What kind of control do we actually have here? What could we actually change?
Well, the first thing is if you want to prevent future conversations from being reviewed or used to improve their AI, you can turn off Gemini apps activity.
Okay, step one.
That's step one.
Yes.
You can go into your Gemini app's activity log and you can review your prompts and delete past conversations.
Okay, so you can erase some of your digital footprint. But what does deleting actually do? Is it truly gone from Google servers, or is it just hidden from view?
That's a great question, and they actually address that.
Okay.
They say conversations that have already been reviewed by humans are not deleted when you delete your Gemini app's activity.
Okay.
They are kept separately, not connected to your account, for up to 3 years.
3 years, wow.
Yeah.
So even when you hit that delete button, it's not necessarily a clean slate.
No.
There are still remnants of your conversations floating around out there. What about conversations that haven't been reviewed yet?
So even if you turn off Gemini app's activity completely, your conversations are still saved with your account, full up to 72 hours.
Okay.
They say this is to allow Google to provide the service and to be able to process any feedback that you might provide.
So there's always a little bit of a lag, even when you're actively trying to manage your data.
Right.
It really makes you think twice about what you share, doesn't it?
It does, yeah. And it's important to remember that turning off Gemini app's activity doesn't affect your other Google data settings like web and app activity or location history.
Okay.
Those might still be collecting data in the background.
So turning off Gemini app's activity isn't like a one-size-fits-all privacy solution.
No,
You have to be aware of all the different settings and how they all interact.
absolutely.
Okay. Speaking of interacting, the next section gets into how Gemini app's activity works with other services and settings, which is where I think things can start to get a little complicated.
Yeah.
So let's break this down. What happens when you start integrating Gemini with other Google services? Do those other services now get access to all the data that Gemini is collecting?
That's exactly what happens, yeah.
Okay.
So those other Google services will also start saving and using your data according to their own specific policies and the general Google privacy policy. It's kind of a domino effect.
And what if you're interacting with third-party services through Gemini apps? Like if you ask Gemini to book you a restaurant reservation or schedule a ride, is your data suddenly being shared with these companies that you've never even heard of?
Unfortunately, the answer is yes.
Okay.
Those third-party services will process your data according to their own privacy policies, which could be very different from Google's policies.
So the takeaway here is to be extra cautious when you're connecting Gemini apps with other services, whether they're from Google or a third party. Do your research, make sure you're comfortable with how they handle your data.
Absolutely.
Okay, now for a section that sounds pretty self-explanatory, requesting content removal and exporting your information.
Right.
What do we need to know about this?
Yeah, this section is pretty straightforward.
Okay.
They just lay out your rights regarding your data. So you can request the removal of content that violates Google's policies or applicable laws.
Okay.
And you can also request a copy of your data.
So you do have some recourse if you believe your data is being mishandled or if you simply want to know what they have on file. Good to know. Okay, now things get a little more specific for Android users. With the section, you can use Gemini, hosted by the Google app, as your device assistant on Android.
Right.
What's going on here?
Yeah, so this section's all about what happens when you make Gemini your go-to helper on your Android device. And it explains the additional data handling that occurs when Gemini is set as your default assistant.
Okay, this applies to me. So what kind of additional data handling are we talking about?
Well, basically, when Gemini becomes your default assistant, it gains access to kind of a whole suite of system permissions and data.
Okay.
So we're talking about things like your dialer, call and message logs, contacts, installed apps, preferred language, and even screen content.
Wait, hold up. They can see everything on my screen. Even if I'm like browsing something I'd rather not share?
Well, they claim that this access is necessary to be able to understand you better, respond to your requests more effectively, and generally help you get things done.
Okay.
For example, knowing your contacts allows Gemini to help you make calls or send messages more easily. And seeing your screen content allows it to provide, contextually relevant assistance.
Okay, I can see the logic there, but it still feels a little unnerving to think about how much access they have. What about integration with Google Assistant? How does that work?
So Gemini actually relies on Google Assistant for certain tasks, like controlling smart home devices or setting alarms.
Okay.
And when that happens, some of your existing Google Assistant settings, like personal results, will also apply to Gemini.
Interesting. So my preferences from Google Assistant carry over to Gemini.
Exactly.
Okay, and what are personal results, by the way?
So basically, it means you'll receive personalized information based on your data. So that could include, reminders, upcoming appointments, even recommendations based on your past activity.
So it's all about making the experience more tailored to you, but it also means they're building an even more comprehensive profile of your habits and preferences.
Precisely.
Okay. And then that brings us to the issue of hands-free activation. So if you have Hey Google and Voice Match turned on, you can talk to either Gemini or Google Assistant hands-free, whichever one is active at that moment.
Right.
That sounds convenient, but also kind of risky. What if Gemini activates when you don't intend it to? Like, what if it mishears a word or you accidentally, brush the activation button on your phone?
They acknowledge that unintended activation can happen, especially if there's a noise that kind of sounds like, "Hey, Google."
Okay.
However, they say that if Gemini responds to an unintended activation, it will treat your input as a normal activation.
So even accidental activation gets logged.
It does.
It's definitely something to keep in mind if you're concerned about privacy. Okay, supplemental features. What's hidden in this section?
Yeah, this is where they talk about kind of the optional features that can enhance your Gemini app's experience,
Okay.
but also might involve collecting some additional data.
So, give us some examples. What kind of supplemental features?
So one example they give are gems.
Gems. Okay.
So these are personalized elements that you can create and save to customize Gemini's responses.
Okay.
So for example, you might create a gem called My Favorite Recipes.
Right.
And store your go-to recipes there.
That sounds kind of cool, but what kind of data are these gems collecting?
So they collect the names that you choose for your gems and any custom instructions you might provide.
Okay.
And as with a lot of the other data points, they use this information to improve Google AI, including through those human reviewers we were talking about earlier.
So even those seemingly innocuous, personalized features are contributing to the development of their AI.
It's all interconnected.
Everything's connected. All right. Things to know. Last section of this privacy notice for now. What do we need to know?
So I think of this as the disclaimer section.
Okay.
They emphasize that Gemini apps are a new technology that is constantly evolving,
Okay.
and they may sometimes provide inaccurate, offensive, or inappropriate information.
So they're admitting that their AI might make mistakes or say things that are off color.
They are, yeah.
Why the disclaimer, though?
Well, they also stress that you should not rely on Gemini apps for professional advice.
Right.
Be it medical, legal, financial, or anything else.
That's a good point. It's easy to get caught up in the, magic of AI and forget that it's still just a tool and a flawed one at that.
It is.
Okay, and then lastly...
Well, lastly, they encourage users to provide feedback stating that it'll help make Gemini apps better.
So they're acknowledging that they're still learning and improving. It's good to see that they're open to user input.
Absolutely. Yeah.
Okay, so that's it for the Gemini Apps Privacy Notice section, but we are not done yet. There's still more to uncover. We'll be right back.
So before we dive into all the really interesting details in the privacy questions section, let's just quickly touch on the terms of service.
Okay?
It's pretty short, but there are a couple of important things in there.
Okay, hit me with the key points. What do I, as a user, need to know about these terms?
The main thing is that the general Google Terms of Service and the Generative AI Prohibited Use Policy apply to Gemini apps.
Okay,
So all those rules and restrictions you agreed to when you signed up for your Google account,
right?
they apply to your use of Gemini too.
That makes sense. It would be a nightmare to have separate terms for every single Google product.
It would, yeah.
Anything else we should be aware of?
They do have an extra clause specifically for Korea-based consumers,
Okay,
stating that they must also agree to the Korean location terms of service.
interesting.
So if you're tuning in from Korea, there may be some specific location-related rules that apply when you're using Gemini apps.
I guess different regions have different regulations and considerations when it comes to data privacy, especially location data.
Mm-hmm.
Okay. So now for the part that I know everyone's been waiting for, the privacy questions section.
Right.
This is where we really get down into the nitty-gritty details about how Gemini apps handles your data.
Exactly.
Let's do it. Lay on me. What are the burning questions people have about Gemini apps and their data?
Well, they start with a section just titled General, and they begin with really the most basic question of all. What are Gemini apps?
It seems like a good place to start. I mean, even after all this, I bet some people are still a little fuzzy on exactly what falls under that Gemini umbrella.
It's good to clarify, for sure.
Yeah. So what is it?
So they give a very clear list of what's handled. The Gemini web app at gemini.google.com. The Gemini mobile apps for both Android and iOS. And by the way, that includes the Gemini tab within Google app on iOS devices.
Okay.
And Gemini within the Google Messages app in certain locations.
So it's a multi-platform experience, but it's specifically contained within these designated Google offerings.
Yes, that's right.
Okay, good to have that clarified. What other mysteries does this general section unravel?
So they address the issue of objecting to data processing or requesting corrections to your data.
Okay, so if you're not happy with how your data is being used, or if you think they have something wrong, you have some options.
You do.
What do you do if you need to make a request like that?
Well, they provide instructions for how to create a request through their help center or directly within the Gemini apps themselves.
Okay, so it's good to know you have some recourse and that they make the process relatively straightforward. I always think it's a good sign when a company actually makes it easy to access and manage your data.
Definitely.
Speaking of which, what about those legal justifications for processing data, especially under EU and UK law?
Yeah.
I know those regulations are pretty strict.
They are, yeah. So they do address that here. They explain their legal basis for processing your data, which I'll admit can get a little bit complex.
Okay.
But let's try to break it down into a few key points.
Okay, I'm ready for a legal crash course.
All right, so first up is performance of a contract.
Okay.
Basically, they're saying that processing your data is necessary to actually provide the Gemini app service that you've requested, and that request, legally speaking, falls under your agreement to the Google Terms of Service.
Okay, so by using Gemini apps, you're entering into a sort of digital contract where they're allowed to use your data to fulfill their end of the bargain, which is to, actually make the AI work.
Right.
Gotcha.
Okay, then there's Google and third parties' legitimate interests with appropriate safeguards to protect your privacy.
That's a mouthful.
It is.
Okay, and what falls under legitimate interests? That sounds like a pretty wide net.
It does cover a lot of ground.
Yeah.
It includes things like improving their services, developing new products, and generally understanding user behavior. They're basically saying that using our data benefits both them and us as users, and that they're taking steps to protect our privacy in the process.
I could see how that could be open to interpretation.
It is, yeah.
A bit of a balancing act between their business needs and our privacy rights.
Right.
Okay, so what else? What other legitimate interests do they cite?
Well, they also use this justification to explain why they process data to maintain the functionality, safety, and reliability of their services. So this includes things like, detecting fraud and abuse.
So it's not just about making the AI better, it's also about protecting users and the platform from bad actors.
Right, exactly. And then, of course, there are legal obligations.
Right.
So they'll process data to comply with laws, regulations, legal processes, or governmental requests.
So if the law requires them to hand over your data, they'll comply. No surprises there.
Right. And then finally, there's your consent. So this comes into play for certain features, like voice match,
Right.
where you're actively choosing to give them access to specific data.
So it's not just a blanket acceptance.
No,
They might request additional consent for new features or functionalities down the line.
that's right. Yeah.
Okay, all right. Ready to dive into the next section of privacy questions, which is, what data is collected? How is it used?
Let's do it.
I feel like we've already covered this to some extent, but I'm sure there are more detail to uncover.
There are, yeah. This section does overlap a bit with what we discussed in the Gemini app's privacy notice,
Okay.
but they do provide additional examples and context here.
Okay, so it's a little bit of a recap, but with more depth.
Yes.
What are the key things they're highlighting here?
So they're re-emphasizing that they collect your conversations, your location, your feedback, and general usage data.
Okay.
And as we talked about earlier, when Gemini is set up as your mobile assistant, they collect even more information, including data from your devices and services, permissions that you've granted, installed apps, even your screen context.
Right, we talked about that earlier. It is a little unsettling how much access they have when Gemini is your primary assistant, but they do argue that it's needed to provide those personalized, context-aware experiences.
That's their argument, yeah.
And they reiterate that when you use Gemini extensions, data is shared between Gemini apps and those other apps and services you've connected.
Right.
We'll get into extensions a little bit later, but let's stick with how they're actually using all this data they're collecting.
Sure.
They keep mentioning improvement and development. What does that actually mean in concrete terms?
So they actually give some concrete examples this time.
Okay.
So they talk about using your past conversations, your location, other related information to generate responses that are more tailored to you. So theoretically, the more you interact with Gemini, the more personalized and relevant its responses should become.
So it's a self-improving system that learns from each interaction.
That's right.
But are they doing anything else with our data besides trying to make Gemini a better conversationalist?
They also mention using feedback to make Gemini apps safer and to address common problems encountered with large language models.
So they're actively using feedback to try to improve the overall user experience, not just the AI's conversational abilities.
Right.
Okay. And I guess to demonstrate their commitment to transparency, they even provide a link to Google's privacy principles, highlighting how they keep your data private, safe, and secure.
That's great.
Okay, so now let's get to the question that's probably on everyone's mind. Do you use my Gemini app's conversations to show me ads?
And the answer, as of February 12, 2025, is no.
Okay, that's reassuring, but they are very careful to say as of today, which implies it could change in the future, right?
It could, yes.
So for now, our late-night ramblings with Gemini are not being mined for marketing gold.
Right.
But things could change. Speaking of things that might make people a little uneasy, let's address the question, who has access to my Gemini app's conversations?
Right.
This is the one where I think a lot of people start to get a little nervous.
Understandably so.
So what do they say?
So they start by reassuring us that they take privacy very seriously and do not sell personal information to anyone.
Okay, that's good to hear, but if they're not selling it, who is seeing our data? We already know that human reviewers are involved, but is there anyone else looking in the shadows?
Okay, so they explain that to help Gemini improve while protecting privacy, they select a subset of conversations and they use automated tools to remove identifying information like email addresses and phone numbers.
So they're taking steps to anonymize the data before anyone can see it.
Exactly.
Okay, and then
So then these anonymized conversations are reviewed by trained reviewers, which can include third parties. And these anonymized conversations are kept separately from your Google account for up to 3 years.
3 years.
Yeah.
Okay, so they're stripping out the obvious identifiers and having trained professionals review the anonymized data. But it still makes you wonder, like, how effective is that anonymization process? Couldn't someone with access to the raw data potentially figure out who said what?
It's a good question, and they don't really give a lot of details about the specifics of their anonymization techniques.
It's a bit of a black box.
It is.
Okay, all right, let's move on to a more practical question. Can I access and delete my data from my Google account?
Yes.
This feels like a crucial one.
It is, and the answer is a very clear yes.
Okay, good.
They actually provide a link to your Gemini apps activity, which is where you can manage and delete your data.
Okay, so you have direct control over what's being stored. What exactly can you do in this Gemini apps activity section?
So you can see all of your activity. You can turn off Gemini apps activity altogether. You can review your prompts. You can delete your activity. And you can even change the auto-delete settings, which we talked about earlier.
So you have a decent amount of control over your data footprint.
You do.
But didn't they say that even when you delete your data, conversations are still saved with your account for up to 72 hours?
That's right. They reiterate that point here.
Okay.
Even after you hit delete, conversations are kept for up to 72 hours to allow them to provide the service and process any feedback you might submit.
So that 72-hour lag seems to be a recurring theme here. Data retention is clearly something they take very seriously, even if it's for seemingly benign reasons.
It is, yeah.
Okay, let's circle back to that whole human review issues. I know a lot of people have questions about this. The question this time is, why is human review of my Gemini app's conversations, feedback, and related data required?
Right.
So let's delve into the why behind the human reviewers.
Yeah.
They touched on it earlier, but I'm curious to hear their full justification.
So they say that human review is necessary to make Google services safer, more helpful, and better for all users, and that includes improving the generative machine learning models that power Gemini apps.
So it's for the greater good.
Mm-hmm.
They're using our data to make the AI better for everyone. But how does this process actually work? What are those reviewers actually doing with our data?
So trained reviewers look at conversations to assess if Gemini apps' responses are low quality, inaccurate, or harmful.
So it's like a quality control check, making sure the AI stays on track and doesn't go off the rails.
Exactly.
And if they find issues.
If they find issues, trained evaluators suggest higher quality responses, which then go back into the system and create a better data set for the AI to learn from.
So it's a feedback loop.
It is.
Human reviewers helping to refine and improve the AI's responses over time.
That's right.
Okay, that makes sense. Now let's talk about data retention again.
Okay.
The question this time is, why does Google retain my conversations after I turn off Gemini apps activity? And what does Google do with this data? So this is a big one. We know they keep conversations for up to 72 hours, even when activity is turned off. But what's the rationale?
Okay, so they say they need those conversations to be able to respond to you contextually and to have context for any feedback you might submit.
Okay.
And they also claim that they need the 72-hour retention period to ensure data availability in case of system failures.
So if there's a glitch or an outage, they don't lose all that conversational data.
Right.
Okay, so it's about maintaining a seamless user experience, processing feedback efficiently, and ensuring that the system is stable and resilient.
Mm-hmm.
Makes sense from a technical perspective.
Yeah.
But what about using this data to actually improve their AI? That's where things get a little hazy.
Right. They explicitly state that if you turn off Gemini app activity, they do not use your new conversations to improve their generative machine learning technologies unless you explicitly submit feedback about a conversation.
Okay, so they're drawing a line in the sand.
They are.
They're retaining the data, but they're not actively using it for AI training unless you, the user, give them explicit permission through your feedback.
Exactly.
Okay. All right, now let's talk about that feedback loop. The next question is, how does Google use my feedback?
Okay.
Does it actually make a difference? Does it matter?
They want you to know that it does, that they do take your feedback seriously.
Okay.
So when you submit feedback, they review it carefully, along with any content you've included, like files or personal information from extensions.
Okay.
And they look at the associated conversations and all related data.
Okay.
And this is all handled by specially trained teams.
So they're not just collecting feedback and throwing it into a digital void.
No.
Real people are actually analyzing it and trying to learn from it.
Yes.
And they emphasize that This level of human review is necessary to identify, address, and report potential problems raised in the feedback, which in some cases is even required by law.
That's right.
Okay, so feedback plays a vital role, not just in improving the AI, but also in ensuring safety and legal compliance.
Exactly.
Okay, and they reiterate that they use this data to improve their products and services, which is all laid out in their privacy policy. It all circles back to those core principles of data usage.
It does.
Okay, I'm sensing a pattern here. They're very consistent in their messaging about how they use our data.
Yes, they are.
Okay, all right, enough about the nitty-gritty details. Let me get a little philosophical for a moment.
Sure.
The next question is, what does it mean that Gemini is a new and evolving technology?
Right.
Ah, yes, the existential implications of artificial intelligence.
Exactly.
I'm all ears. What insights do they offer about this constantly changing landscape?
Well, so they start by explaining that Gemini apps are powered by what are called large language models, or LLMs.
Okay.
These are essentially very complex algorithms that have been trained on massive amounts of data.
So it's all about the data that fuels these models.
Exactly.
But what makes Gemini apps unique or different from other LLMs out there? I mean, there's a lot of AI chatbots popping up these days.
Right. Well, they explain that these models are pre-trained on a variety of data from publicly available sources.
Okay.
And through this pre-training process, they learn to identify patterns in language and predict the next word in a sequence.
So it's like predictive text on steroids.
Yeah, that's a good way to put it.
Yeah.
But if an LLM only picked the most probable next word, the responses would be very predictable and, frankly, pretty boring.
Right.
So they've actually designed the models to have some flexibility.
Okay.
So they can choose from a range of reasonable and slightly less probable words.
So they're injecting a bit of randomness and creativity into the mix.
They are.
Okay. Otherwise, it would just feel like talking to a very predictable robot.
Exactly. But this flexibility also explains why LLMs and by extension Gemini apps aren't always accurate.
Right. Right.
They're trained to predict words, not to be factual databases or retrieval systems.
Right. So they can sound very convincing even when they're making things up. And that's where things can get a little tricky, right?
They can.
Especially if people are taking what the AI says as fact.
Right. They acknowledge that that can be a problem, especially when you're dealing with factual information.
Okay.
And it's a problem they're still working on.
So they're upfront about the limitations of this technology.
They are.
What other areas are they still working on in terms of this evolving aspect of Gemini?
Well, they mentioned several challenges that they're actively addressing, including accuracy, bias, persona, false positives and negatives, and vulnerability to adversarial prompting.
Okay, that's a lot.
It's a lot.
Let's break it down one by one. What do they mean by accuracy? I mean, we've already touched on that a bit, but let's dig a little deeper.
Sure. So they acknowledge that Gemini app's responses might be inaccurate, especially when dealing with complex or nuanced subjects.
Okay.
So they're working to improve accuracy, but it's still a fundamental limitation of the technology.
So takeaway here is, don't take everything Gemini says as gospel.
Right.
Always double check your facts. Okay. Bias, which is a big one when it comes to AI. I mean, anytime you're training an AI model on data created by humans, there's a risk of bias creeping in.
Absolutely.
I mean, our world is full of biases, so it makes sense that those biases could end up reflected in the AI's responses.
Right.
So what are they doing to address that?
So they admit that Gemini app responses might reflect biases present in the training data,
Okay.
but they're actively working to mitigate bias and ensure that the AI is as fair and impartial as possible.
It's a complex challenge, but an important one to address. Okay, persona. What do they mean by that?
So they're referring to the fact that Gemini apps might inadvertently project a persona, suggesting it has personal opinions, feelings, or beliefs, even though it's just a machine.
Right. It's easy to anthropomorphize AI, especially when it's designed to be conversational. But it's crucial to remember that it's not actually a person with its own thoughts and feelings.
It is not, and they are aware of this potential for misinterpretation.
Okay.
They're working to ensure that Gemini doesn't come across as too human-like, and that users understand it's still just a machine, even if it can sometimes feel like a friend.
Right, right. Okay, so false positives and false negatives. What does that even mean in the context of AI?
So basically, it means that Gemini might not respond to some appropriate prompts while giving inappropriate responses to others.
Okay.
So think of it like setting the sensitivity on a spam filter.
Right, right.
You want to catch all the bad stuff, but you don't want to accidentally block legitimate messages.
It's a balancing act.
It is.
Okay. And then the last challenge they mention is vulnerability to adversarial prompting. This one sounds a bit ominous.
Yeah.
I have to admit, I have no idea what that means.
So think of it as someone deliberately trying to trick or manipulate Gemini apps into saying or doing things that it shouldn't.
Oh, so like trying to break the system or find its weaknesses.
Exactly.
Okay.
It's a constant cat and mouse game.
Right.
As AI gets more sophisticated, so do the methods for trying to exploit it.
And I can see how that would be a major concern for the developers. Okay, let's move on to a question that's a little more grounded in everyday use. What happens when I ask Gemini apps to save info?
Okay.
So this refers to those times when you might ask Gemini to remember something specific, like a fact, a preference, even an idea.
Right.
So it's like building your own little knowledge base within Gemini.
That's a good way to put it, yeah.
Yeah, so what happens to that information?
So they explain that that information is stored until you decide to delete it.
Okay,
And you can actually turn this saving feature off at any time.
okay, so you have control over what's saved and how it's used. Good to know. All right, now let's get into the nitty-gritty of location data with a section titled Location and Other Permissions Information. I think this is one of the most sensitive areas when it comes to privacy.
It is, yeah.
Location data can reveal a lot about someone's habits and movements.
Mm-hmm.
So it's no surprise that people are very concerned about how it's used. So what do they have to say about location data and Gemini apps?
Okay, so this is where things get interesting. They start by saying that location data is always collected when you use Gemini apps, regardless of your settings.
Hold on, always. Even if I've gone into my phone settings and disabled location services for Gemini apps,
That's what they're saying.
or you think there's no way to opt out of location tracking?
It doesn't seem like it, no. They argue that location data is absolutely necessary to be able to provide relevant responses to your queries.
Okay, I can see the logic there. If I ask, like, what's the weather like today, or find me a good pizza place nearby, it needs to know my general location to give me a useful answer.
Exactly, yeah.
But they do clarify that the type of location data they collect varies.
Right.
So walk me through the different types of location data and how they're used. I think it's important for people to understand the nuances here.
Sure. So by default, they use what they call your general area.
Okay?
So this is derived from your IP address or from any home or work addresses you might have saved in your Google account.
Okay.
And they use this general location data for more general queries, like the weather example you just mentioned.
So in those cases, they're not necessarily pinpointing my exact location. They're just getting a general sense of where I am in the world.
Right. It's like knowing what city you're in, but not necessarily, your precise street address.
Right.
Now, here's the other side of the coin. With your permission, they can also access and process your precise location data.
Okay. And when would they need that level of precision?
So think about requests like, where's the closest coffee shop?
Right.
Or find me a gas station on my route.
Okay.
For those types of location-specific requests, they need your precise coordinates to give you accurate results.
Okay, that makes sense. But I'm a little concerned about them having access to my precise location. How is that data handled?
So they are very specific about how they handle precise location data. They say that it is not stored in your Gemini app's activity.
Okay, so they're treating that information with extra care.
Yeah.
What about the general location data, the stuff they derive from my IP address or saved addresses? How do they handle that?
So they explain that this general area data is coarsened before it's stored with your Gemini app's activity.
Okay.
So think of it like they're zooming out on the map and grouping you with other users in a larger area to protect your privacy.
Okay, so it's not perfect anonymity, but it's a step in the right direction.
It is.
And they clarify that this general area is typically much larger than 3 square kilometers, especially if you're outside of a densely populated city.
Right.
Okay. So they are taking steps to anonymize the location data to some extent. Now let's talk about those other permissions mentioned in the section title. What kind of permissions are we talking about here?
So on mobile devices, Gemini apps might request access to various features and capability on your device.
Okay.
So this could be things like your camera, microphone, contacts, or, as we've already discussed, your location.
Right, right.
So, it's similar to other apps. You, the user, have the power to grant or deny these permissions.
Right. You can go into the app settings on your device and decide what level of access is comfortable with.
Exactly.
All right, let's move on to the next section, which is about uploaded files. I'm curious to see what they have to say about this.
This is a good one. Yeah, so this section covers what happens when you upload a file, like an image or a document, as part of your interaction with Gemini apps.
So let's say I upload a photo, and I ask Gemini to describe it. What happens to that image once it's been uploaded?
So first, they explain that you can review all of your uploaded files in your pinned chats and your recent chats within the Gemini app's interface.
Okay.
So they're not disappearing into some digital abyss.
Right.
You can keep track of what you've shared.
You can see it?
Yeah, and you can also delete any prompts that you uploaded files to by going into your Gemini app's activity. Now, what happens to the files themselves depends on where you uploaded them from.
Oh, okay. What do you mean by that?
Okay, so if you uploaded a file directly from your device, it's permanently deleted when you delete the related prompt in your activity log.
Okay.
But if you uploaded a file from Google Drive, deleting the prompt in Gemini apps doesn't actually delete the file from your drive.
Oh, okay.
It just removes it from the conversation.
So it's like unlinking the file from the conversation, but not actually deleting it from its original location.
Exactly. Yeah, it's important to keep in mind that deleting something in one app might not delete it everywhere.
Right, right. Good point. Okay, now, for the part that I think is the most intriguing and maybe a little creepy, how does Google work with my uploaded images?
This is where things get really interesting.
Yeah.
They explain that when you upload an image, they use Google Lens technology to understand what's in the image and read any text that might be embedded in it.
So it's not just storing the image, it's actually trying to interpret it, extract meaning from it.
That's right. And they give an example. So Google Lens might analyze an image and determine that it contains a cat jumping over a fence.
Okay.
And that description is then added to your prompt to help Gemini apps understand what you're asking.
Okay, I get it. They're using Google Lens to enhance the AI's comprehension, not to spy on us.
Right, and they explicitly state that they do not use the actual images or their pixels to train their generative machine learning technology.
But there's always a but, isn't there?
You know me too well. They say they don't use images for AI training unless you include them in your feedback.
Oh, okay.
So if you choose to include an image in your feedback, they might use it to train their models, but they do give you the option to opt out.
So once again, they're giving us some control over how our data is used.
Exactly.
Okay. And they promise to be transparent if they ever change how they use uploaded images in the future.
They do.
Good. Transparency is key when it comes to data privacy. What about the broader question of how does Google use my uploaded files? Are there any other uses besides image analysis and feedback?
So they say they might analyze files in connection with your prompt and use them to provide information about the file itself in their response.
Okay.
So if you upload a document and ask for a summary, they'll need to analyze the content of that document to fulfill your request.
Right. That seems pretty straightforward.
It is, yeah. And they reiterate that they currently do not use uploaded files to train their generative AI models unless you include them in your feedback.
So it's all about giving you control over how your data is used.
It is.
Okay, good to hear. All right, generated images. Now we're talking about AI art, right?
We are. This section focuses on the images that Gemini apps themselves might create in response to your requests.
So if I ask Gemini to draw me a picture of a unicorn eating a pizza, it might actually generate an image based on that prompt.
It might.
That's wild. Okay, and then what happens to these generated images? Are they stored somewhere? Can the other people see them?
So you can review all of the images that Gemini generates in your pinned chats, your recent chats, and in your Gemini app's activity log.
Okay.
And as with other types of content, you can delete your prompts, which also deletes any images that were generated in those responses.
Okay, so you have control over what's generated and how long it's stored. But what about Google's use of this data? Are they using these AI-generated images for their own purposes?
So they state that they use this data in accordance with their privacy notice to provide, improve, and develop their products and services.
So it's back to those core principles of data usage we've been discussing.
It is.
Right, they're pretty consistent on that front.
They are, and they specifically mention that if you submit feedback on generated images, they might use that data to refine the image generation process.
Okay.
So your feedback is helping to make the AI a better artist.
That's kind of cool. It's like a collaborative art project between humans and machines.
Yeah, exactly.
All right, on to the next section, extensions. This sounds like where things could get a little more complicated.
It does.
Yeah.
So extensions are those third-party integrations that can connect Gemini apps with other tools, apps, and services.
Okay.
So think of them like plugins that can expand Gemini's functionality.
Okay, so it's like adding superpowers to Gemini.
Yeah.
But what does that mean for our data? Are we opening up a can of worms here when we start connecting to third-party extensions?
That's the million-dollar question.
Yeah.
So the first question they address is, what happens with my data that Gemini apps share with Gemini extensions?
Okay, so they're acknowledging that data might be leaving the safe confines of Gemini apps and flowing into these third-party extensions.
Right.
Okay, and what kind of data are we talking about here?
Okay, so they list the types of data that might be shared, and it includes information from your conversation, your device, preferences, like your language settings, and even your location informations.
Whoa, that's a lot of potentially sensitive data.
It is.
So what safeguards are in place to protect this data once it's shared with these extensions?
Well, so they explain that with your permission, Gemini apps might tell certain extensions who you are, and this is needed, to connect Gemini apps with your personal information and content in other apps and services so that they can fulfill your requests.
So it's all about personalization and making those integrations seamless.
Exactly.
But it comes at a cost, right? More data is being shared across different platforms.
It does, yeah. And they also point out that if you use Gemini apps to change shared content or control shared devices and other services, those actions might be visible to anyone with access to that shared content or device. So it's really important to think about the potential privacy implications when you're connecting Gemini apps with other services and devices.
Right, okay. All right, what about those third-party apps and services themselves? Are they held to the same data privacy standards as Google? How are they handling our data once it's been shared?
Right. They address this directly. They state that third-party apps and services use the data according to their own privacy policies.
Oh, okay, so we're not just dealing with one set of rules here.
No.
We need to be aware of Gemini apps policies and the policies of every single extension we connect to.
That's right, yeah.
It can get overwhelming trying to keep track of it all,
It can.
but it is crucial if you care about your data privacy.
It is.
Do your research before connecting to any third-party extensions. Make sure you're comfortable with how they handle your data.
Right.
Okay, good advice. What about data moving in the other direction? The next question they address is about data that Gemini apps get from Gemini extensions. What's happening there?
So this is about those times when you're using extensions to connect Gemini apps with your information and content on your device or in other tools, apps, and services.
Right.
It's about making Gemini more aware of your broader digital life and preferences.
Right, so it's all about creating a more personalized and integrated experience. But it raises some privacy concerns. Are they using this data from third-party extensions to train their AI models? Or, even worse, target us with ads?
They address that specifically. They say that personal content pulled from Google services through extensions is not accessed by reviewers, used to improve their AI, or used for advertising purposes.
Okay, so at least on that front, we can breathe a sigh of relief.
We can.
But what about data from non-Google services? Are there any guarantees there?
Unfortunately, they don't specifically address that.
A little concerning.
Yeah.
So it's another one of those proceed with caution situations.
Right.
If you're connecting Gemini apps to third-party services, do your research. Make sure you're comfortable with how they might be using your data.
Exactly.
All right, now let's talk about a very specific use case for extensions, making calls, and sending messages. They have a whole section devoted to how your data is used when you leverage Gemini extensions for communication.
Right.
Okay, I'm intrigued. I could definitely see the convenience of asking Gemini to make a phone call for me or send a text message. But what kind of data is being shared in that process?
So they're pretty transparent about it. If you use extensions for calling or messaging, they collect your Gemini app's activity, device calling and messaging logs, contact information, and device information and settings.
Whoa, that's a lot of data to hand over just to make a phone call or send a quick text.
It is.
Why do they need all that information?
So they say it's used to choose the most helpful calling or messaging extension to use and to ensure they connect you with the right person.
So it's about efficiency and accuracy.
Right.
But it seems like a pretty steep price to pay in terms of privacy.
It is, and they highlight an interesting point. So if you've previously used the Gemini mobile app to make calls or send messages, with the help of Google Assistant, up to 90 days of your saved Google Assistant communications request history might be imported to your Gemini app's activity.
So they're pulling data from other Google services to create a more complete picture of your communication patterns.
Right.
Okay. And they reiterate that you do have control over this data.
You do.
You can delete your activity in your Gemini app's activity log, or you can just turn off calling and messaging extensions entirely if you're not comfortable with the data sharing.
That's right.
So you have choices.
You do.
You can embrace the convenience and accept the data sharing, or you can opt for a more privacy-conscious approach and manage those settings accordingly.
Absolutely.
Okay. All right, let's move on to a feature that's becoming increasingly popular, Gemini Live. I'm curious to see what they have to say about data privacy in the context of real-time interactions.
Okay, so this is where things get particularly interesting. They start by explaining that recordings and transcripts of your Gemini Live interactions, as well as any other content you might share during those live chats, are handled according to the general Gemini app's privacy notice.
So it's all under the same data umbrella we've been discussing.
It is.
But what about the storage of those recordings and transcripts? Where do they end up?
So if your Gemini app's activity is turned on, these recordings and transcripts are stored in your Gemini app's activity log, which, as we've discussed, you can manage and delete as you see fit.
Okay, so it's business as usual if activities turn on. What if it's turned off?
If your Gemini app's activity is off, your Gemini Live chats are still stored in your Google account, but only for up to 72 hours.
That 72-hour retention period seems to be a recurring theme.
It does, yeah.
It's like a little grace period for data before it's either permanently stored or deleted. Okay, so now here's where things get a little tricky. If your Gemini app's activity is turned on, the transcripts of your live chats are used to improve Google AI.
That's right.
Okay, so they're using our live interactions to train their models, but only if we've actively opted into activity tracking.
Correct. But they make an important distinction. So they do not currently use live audio recordings for AI improvement.
Okay, so they're drawing a line there.
Yes.
They're using the text, but not the actual audio recordings.
Right. However, they do say currently, which, as we've seen before, implies that this practice could change in the future.
Yeah, yes.
Something to be aware of.
Always read the fine print.
Yes.
Okay, what about the privacy of other people who might be involved in these live interactions? Like, if I'm having a Gemini Live chat with a group of friends, are they being recorded and analyzed too?
So they do address that.
Okay.
They strongly encourage users to respect others' privacy and ask for permission before recording or including anyone in a live chat.
Okay.
It's a good reminder that even in the world of AI, basic courtesy and respect for privacy still apply.
Absolutely. It's easy to get caught up in the excitement of new technology and forget about the potential impact on others. Okay, on to the final section of privacy questions, which is all about GEMs.
Okay.
Right, we touched on GEMs earlier, but let's unpack exactly how they handle data.
Sure. So they start by explaining that the information you provide when creating GEMs, such as the names and custom instructions, is used to generate tailored responses.
So it's all about making the AI more relevant to your specific needs and preferences.
That's right. But as with many of the other data points, they also use this information to improve their overall AI, which of course includes those human reviewers we've been talking about.
Yeah, it seems like everything circles back to those human reviewers. So even those seemingly harmless personalized features are contributing to the development of their AI.
That's right. It's all part of the feedback loop.
Right, right. Now, what happens if you turn off Gemini app's activity? Does that affect how GEMs work?
Okay, so they clarify that if you turn off activity, any GEMs you've already created will still be saved within Gemini apps.
Okay.
However, any chats that involve those GEMs will not be saved, except for that 72-hour retention period we've discussed.
So they're making a distinction between the GEMs themselves, which are like stored profiles, and the actual conversations you have using those GEMs.
That's right. And then finally, they say that any preview chats that you create while building a new gem are not saved at all, regardless of your activity settings.
So you can experiment freely when creating GEMs without worrying about those drafts being recorded and analyzed.
Exactly.
Okay, so that wraps up the privacy questions section. We've covered a lot of ground today, folks.
We have.
It's been quite a journey through the world of Gemini apps and their data privacy practices?
It has. We've learned a lot about the data they collect, how they use it, and, most importantly, the steps you can take to protect your privacy while still enjoying the benefits of this powerful AI technology.
Exactly. And I think the biggest takeaway for me is that awareness is key. It's crucial to read those privacy policies, even if they're long and complicated. Understand what data is being collected, how it's being used, and what control you have over it.
I agree. Knowledge is power.
Absolutely. And with that, we've reached the end of our deep dive into Gemini apps. Thank you for joining us on this data-filled adventure. We hope you found it informative, insightful, and maybe even a little bit empowering.
Until next time, stay curious and stay informed. To 2010-5.
For questions about this information, comment below. Please subscribe and click on the bell to get updates as soon as we hit publish. This is the Danny Mobile Tech and Travel Podcast.